I'm Nicole McNeil, 46, and I command Expeditionary Strike Group 3 out of Naval Base San Diego. For 24 years, I built a career my father refused to attend the commissioning of. A uniform he never wore in a photograph next to me. A rank he could never bring himself to say out loud. But when a 21-year-old Marine on my own gangway put both hands on my chest and shoved me off the brow of my own flagship, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who did not bother to read who you were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. The first time I remember understanding what my father thought of the Navy, I was 7 years old and standing on the Oceanside Pier on a Sunday afternoon in 1986. The wood under my feet smelled like creosote and sea salt and the cheap sunscreen my mother had spread on the back of my neck before we left the house. My father was holding my hand, which was the only way he ever knew how to be a father in public, and out beyond the pier, sliding south down the coast at a stately 12 knots, was a United States Navy destroyer. I asked him what kind of ship she was. I remember he laughed before he answered. He looked down at me, this Marine Master Sergeant who had carried me on his shoulders through 3 duty stations and a deployment, and he said, "Floating hotel, sweetheart. Floating hotel for people who can't handle a real fight." I did not understand the words. I understood the laugh. The laugh said that the gray ship out there was something it was acceptable to look down on. The laugh said that whatever I admired about her, the long clean lines, the slow steadiness, the way she pushed her bow wave outward like she was opening a door, was a thing I was allowed to admire only because I was 7. We stayed on the pier until the destroyer was past the point. I watched her until I could not see her anymore. My father had gone to the railing and was talking to another retired man about a new pickup truck. My mother had gone back to the car. Nobody else was watching the ship. I watched her all the way until she became a dot, and then a smaller dot, and then a piece of haze on the horizon. I remember thinking that the ship in front of me did not look like a hotel. She looked like a city that could move. That is the memory I keep going back to because it is the cleanest one. There were 100 dinners after it. There were Christmas mornings and 4th of July barbecues. There were uniforms hanging in the hall closet and shadow boxes on the wall and a coffee table covered with copies of Leatherneck magazine. My father was not a cruel man. He was, in every measurable way, a good father. He coached my softball team. He showed up to the parent-teacher conferences. He made me practice my multiplication tables on the drive to school. He told me he loved me. In the matter-of-fact way men of his generation could say it on Sunday nights when the dishes were in the sink and the dog was already asleep. I believed him. I also knew by the time I was 12 that my father had 2 daughters. One was the daughter he was raising, and one was the daughter he was going to hand off, eventually, to a recruiter at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego. Sometime in my middle school years, he stopped saying, "If you ever serve," and started saying, "When you serve." Sometime in those same years, I stopped correcting him. My mother was the third corner of the kitchen. She had married my father at 21 because he was steady and tall and because he had a job, and she had spent the next 30 years putting down casseroles. She did not contradict him. She did not contradict anybody. Her quiet was not peace. It was a treaty she had signed before I was born and never read again. She believed in keeping the temperature of the house down. The cost of that kept temperature was paid, mostly, by the 8-year-old at the dinner table who was learning to swallow her opinions like vitamins. I do not remember the moment I decided on the Navy. There is no moment. There's only the long blur of Sunday afternoons at the pier and Friday night news clips of carriers in the Gulf and an 8th grade book report I wrote on the Battle of Midway that my teacher read aloud in class. There is the day in the school library, freshman year, when I pulled an old copy of Blue Jacket's manual off a high shelf and read it standing up for 40 minutes without sitting down. There is the day my father bought himself a new Marine Corps sticker for the back of his pickup and stood in the driveway waxing it, and I stood at my bedroom window watching him with the kind of attention I used to reserve for math problems on the SAT. I loved my father. I did. I just knew by 17 that I was going to be someone he did not already have a uniform for. The fall I was 14, my father retired from the Marine Corps. 20 years and a few extra months. He came home from his final formation on a Friday in 1993 with a flag in a triangular wooden case under his arm. He set the case on the mantel. He took off his coat and hung it in the hall closet. Then he walked into the garage and started sorting his uniforms into a footlocker. and I, for reasons I did not understand, followed him out. The garage smelled like motor oil and old cotton. He had 3 or 4 sets of camis, the older woodland pattern, and a pair of service dress blues hanging in a garment bag, and the white covers stacked on the shelf above his workbench. He was lifting each piece in turn, folding it the way Marines fold things into the footlocker. He saw me in the doorway. He stopped. He picked up a single cover from the shelf, an older one, soft and dark with age. The eagle globe and anchor on the front rubbed almost down to the brass. He held it out to me. "This was my first tour," he said. "I want you to have it." He paused. He looked for a second like the photograph of him I had on the shelf in my bedroom, where he was 22 and standing on a beach in Subic Bay with his arm around a friend who would not come home from the next deployment. He said, "Wherever you wear this, you wear it for your corps." I took the cover. I thanked him. I did not tell him that I had been reading about the United States Naval Academy in the library for 2 months. I did not tell him I had been reading about the Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps program at San Diego State. I did not tell him that the brochure I had taken from the recruiter's table at the school career fair was, at that moment, folded inside the cover of my history textbook on my desk upstairs. I just thanked him, and I went back into the house, and I put the cover on the top shelf of my closet under a sweater. That was the moment I understood, fully, what I was about to do. I had grown up in a house that thought the Navy was a punchline. I had spent 10 years being told by the one parent who was paying attention to me that the only path to a meaningful life ran through a different uniform. And I had decided, somewhere between the Oceanside Pier and that footlocker in the garage, that I was going to wear the punchline. By the time I was 17, I had read every recruiting pamphlet, every history book, every Blue Jackets manual the school library would let me sign out. I had passed the SAT and the ASVAB and the NROTC physical. I had been to a campus tour at San Diego State and a campus tour at Berkeley. I had a yes letter from the Naval ROTC program at San Diego State for a full scholarship on the surface warfare track. I told my parents at Sunday dinner in May of 1997. I waited until the green beans were on the table. My mother was passing the bread. My father was cutting his roast. "I accepted the Navy ROTC scholarship today," I said. "Surface warfare track, San Diego State. I leave in August." My mother's hand kept moving with the bread basket. She did not look up. My father set his fork down. It made the smallest noise against the plate. He looked at me. He looked at my mother, who was studying the napkin in her lap. He looked back at me. He said, "If you wanted to serve, you'd be a Marine. The Navy's for people who couldn't make the cut." I did not answer right away. I could feel my pulse in the cuts at the corner of my jaw where I had braided my hair too tightly that morning. I had rehearsed this conversation for 9 months. I had rehearsed 3 versions of what I was going to say back. In the moment, none of them came. He said, "When you wash out, the door's still here." My mother passed the bread basket the rest of the way around the table. I do not remember most of the rest of that dinner. I remember finishing my green beans. I remember thanking my mother for the meal. I remember standing up to clear plates and seeing my father, still at the table, looking at me with an expression that was not anger. It was disappointment, with the door already closed on it. He had decided, before I had taken my seat, that this was something he was going to wait out. He was going to give me 4 years to fail, and then he was going to be there when I came home. I left for San Diego State 3 months later. My mother drove me. My father that day was at work. He had not worked a Saturday since 1986. The next 4 years were a quiet war of attrition between the man my father had decided I was going to become and the woman I was actually becoming. I was the honor graduate of my NROTC class. I qualified on every shipboard system the program would let me touch. I joined the sailing team and learned to navigate by stars, which I knew was a romantic thing for a young surface warfare officer to do and did anyway. I came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas and birthdays, and at every meal my father asked me when I was going to apply to officer candidate school. Every meal, he would say it as a joke. The joke was that I was, in his telling, still on a train I could get off. My commissioning was on a Saturday in May of 2001. My mother was in the 3rd row. My father was at work. He had not worked a Saturday in 25 years. I crossed the stage. I took the oath. I shook the captain's hand. I went out to dinner with my mother and 3 of my classmates and their families at a restaurant on Shelter Island. And at the end of the meal, my mother handed me an envelope and said, "From your father, he couldn't make it." The envelope contained a card. The card said, in his handwriting, "Congratulations, Nicole. Make us proud." The U.S. was important. He had decided on the day his daughter put on a uniform he disapproved of that he could still hide inside the U.S. I put the card in my purse. I did not cry. I had finished crying about my father 2 years before. My first ship was a Spruance-class destroyer out of Naval Base San Diego. I reported aboard in July of 2001 in service khakis, with 1 gold bar on each collar, an ensign with a fresh haircut and a sea bag, and absolutely no idea how much I did not know. My first commanding officer was a commander in his 44th year of life, who had 3 children and a wife in Coronado, and a way of looking at a young officer that told you, inside of 10 seconds, whether he had decided you were going to be a good officer or a bad one. He looked at me on the first morning for about 8 seconds. Then he said, "Welcome aboard, Ensign McNeil. Get to work." I got to work. I learned everything I could about my ship. I qualified as Officer of the Deck underway, faster than any of the 7 other ensigns in my year group. I stood the mid-watch on rough nights and the dog watch on hot mornings and the in-port quarter-deck watches that taught me, in the way nothing else can teach you, how a Navy ship presents herself to the pier. I learned how to read a deck log. I learned how to read a watch bill. I learned how to read a chief who was not happy about something but had decided not to tell me yet. I did not call home with the news of any of it. I called my mother once a month. She would ask me every time when I was coming home for a visit. I would tell her when. She would say every time, "Your father misses you." I did not know what to do with the sentence. I would say something like, "Tell him hi," and we would hang up. In the fall of 2003, my ship deployed to the Mediterranean for 6 months in support of operations downstream of 9/11. We were attached, for one phase of the deployment, to an amphibious ready group that included a Marine Expeditionary Unit. I was a lieutenant junior grade by then. I was handling bridge-to-bridge coordination on the mid-watch with a Marine major aboard the LHA. He was professional. He was correct. At the end of one long evolution at 0100 local, he keyed his mic and said, "Good work tonight, Lieutenant. Get some sleep." I said, "Aye, sir. You too." He clicked off. I wrote a single line in the journal I kept in my stateroom that night. I have it still. It says, "He's not coming around. I have work to do." I want to be clear about what I had stopped doing. I had not stopped wanting my father's approval. You do not stop wanting that. What I had stopped doing was waiting for it. I had stopped requiring it as a precondition to my work. I had stopped checking, in the quiet moments between watches, whether the next milestone I hit would be the one that would finally bring him to a phone. I had taken the empty chair out of the front row of my own life and put it in the basement where I could not see it from the kitchen. The years did what years do. I made lieutenant at 26. I served as a department head aboard another destroyer at 28. I made lieutenant commander at 30. I went to sea and I came back and I went to sea again. I was selected below zone for commander at 33. The board that picked me did so based on my work, which was the only thing I had ever asked a board to look at. I took command of a destroyer at 34. My first underway as a commanding officer, I stood on the bridge wing of my own ship at 0500 and watched her get underway from a pier she had no business getting underway from in the rain we had, and I did not raise my voice once. I was selected below zone for captain at 38. I commanded a destroyer squadron out of Norfolk for 2 years. I came back to San Diego. I served as deputy commander of a carrier strike group for the long workup before a deployment that did not happen because the world rearranged itself. I made Rear Admiral, lower half, at 44. 2 stars came at 46, and with them came orders to Expeditionary Strike Group 3. 3 amphibious ships at Naval Base San Diego. With my flagship, the brand new America-class amphibious assault ship, USS Tripoli. The day my orders to ESG-3 came down, my mother called me. She did not say much. she said. Your father is proud of you, Nicole. He cannot say it. I am saying it for him. I said, thanks, Mom, she said. Sweetheart, will you take the flag billet? I said, Mom, I already said yes. I took command of Expeditionary Strike Group 3 in October of 2025 at a brief ceremony on the flight deck of USS Tripoli. My father did not attend. He was, I was told, not feeling well. My mother sat in the third row. She wore a coat that was too warm for the day, and I watched her, between the orders being read and the colors being passed, sitting alone in the middle of 3 rows of officers' wives and husbands, with her chin a little high, and I did not let myself think about the empty chair next to her. My first months as a strike group commander were quiet. I learned my staff. I learned my ships. I sailed on USS Tripoli for 2 underway periods in November and December, and I sailed on her sister ship, USS Pearl Harbor, for 1 in January. I stood on a lot of bridges. I drank a lot of bad wardroom coffee. I read every readiness report on my own command that came across my desk, and I read them again, and I made a quiet list of the questions I was going to start asking my captains. By February, I had begun making the kind of unannounced pier visits that I had been promising myself, since I was a lieutenant, that I would make when I had a command of my own. The principle behind them was simple. A ship that is performing for you is not telling you the truth. A ship that is not performing for you is telling you the truth. The only way to see a Navy ship telling you the truth was to walk up the brow when she was not expecting you and watch what happened in the first 90 seconds. I had done it at Pier 8 in November. I had done it at Pier 6 in December. I had done it at Pier 5, where USS Tripoli was moored, twice in January and once already in February. Nobody on Tripoli had said anything to me about it. The watch had stood me up correctly every time. The officer of the deck had read my ID and called the bridge. The captain had appeared within 5 minutes. The ship had operated in those 5 minutes exactly the way a ship is supposed to operate when her commanding admiral has just stepped aboard. On the Tuesday morning in March of 2026 that I'm about to describe, I decided to walk the pier in civilian clothes. I had told my flag aide the night before. She had not loved it. I had reminded her that a strike group commander who could not walk her own pier in jeans was a strike group commander who did not know what her pier looked like. I had told her to follow 10 minutes behind me with the security detail. I had told her to park at the head of the pier and wait for my call. She had said, "Aye, ma'am," in the tone of a flag aide who has had this conversation with her boss before and has lost it before. I parked my own SUV in the visitor lot at 0645. I was wearing dark jeans, a charcoal quarter zip, a plain black ball cap, and a pair of low-top trail shoes. I had my leather wallet with my SEAC and my military ID in the left pocket of my quarter zip. I had a paper coffee cup in my right hand. I had not slept particularly well. I had not been thinking about my father. I had been thinking about a fuel state casualty rate on Tripoli's No. 2 main engine that the engineer's report from the last underway had buried in the 18th bullet of the 3rd paragraph of the 11th page, and I had been thinking about how I was going to bring it up at the next operations brief without embarrassing the engineer. I walked the quarter mile down the pier toward USS Tripoli. The morning was that gray Southern California winter morning that locals call cold and everybody else calls perfect. The marine layer was up over Coronado. The pier was empty. The ship lay alongside, her brow rigged, the watch posted, the colors not yet hoisted because the 8 o'clock morning color ceremony was an hour and a quarter away. I could see the figure of the officer of the deck on the quarterdeck platform above the brow. I could see the Marine sentry standing at the foot of it. I knew the Marine. I did not know him by name. I had seen him on duty twice before. He was a Lance Corporal with a square jaw and a careful posture, and the kind of eyes that have only been a Marine for a year and a half and have not yet learned to soften. He was carrying an M4 carbine on a single-point sling across his front. He had a pistol on his hip. He was, in every way, the United States Marine Corps trains a young Marine to be, on guard. I walked up to the foot of the brow at 0657. I nodded at him. I gave him the half-smile I had been giving Marines at brows for 24 years. I put one foot on the brow. He said, "Wrong ship, ma'am." I kept walking. I said quietly, the way I had said it to a young Marine corporal at Mayport in 2015, "It's the right ship." He stepped forward. He had not been listening to my voice. He had been looking at my ball cap and my quarter zip. he said, sharper this time. "Ma'am, this is a U.S. Navy warship." "Wrong ship." I took another step. He put both hands flat on my chest and he shoved me. I want to describe the next 4 seconds the way I remember them, because I have been trying for 2 months to remember them honestly. I felt his palms hit my sternum and my collarbone. I felt my own weight, which is not much, leave the brow. I had time to register that my coffee cup was still in my right hand and that the lid was already half off it. I had time to register that I was going to land hard on the pier behind me and that the pier was 3 feet below the bottom of the brow and that I had no railing to grab. I had time to register, in some part of my brain that has been a sailor for 24 years, that the Lance Corporal had violated approximately 11 articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice in one motion. I landed on my tailbone first, then on my right elbow. The coffee went everywhere. My ball cap rolled off and skidded 10 feet down the pier and stopped against a bollard. I sat there. I looked at my elbow. The sleeve of my quarter zip was already darkening, and I could feel the warm wet of it through the fabric. I did not say anything. From the platform above, Lieutenant Junior Grade Marcus Tate shouted, "Stay back! Hands where I can see them!" The Lance Corporal was at the top of the brow. He had brought his M4 down off his shoulder and was holding it across his front in the low ready position, pointed at the deck. But the muzzle was angled in my direction in the way that means an alert young Marine has decided he might have to use it. I stood up. I had been on the receiving end of every word a Marine could say to a Navy woman over the course of 24 years. I had been called the wrong thing at gates. I had been told I had the wrong building, the wrong floor, the wrong line, the wrong day. I had been asked in 2005 by a Marine first lieutenant whether I knew where the Officers' Wives Club met. I had laughed about it for a decade. I had stopped laughing about it about 6 years ago. I had never, in 24 years, been on the receiving end of a Marine's hands. I walked back to the foot of the brow. 8 steps, slow. I did not look at the Lance Corporal. I looked up at Tate on the quarterdeck. He had a small handheld scanner in his right hand and the deck log open at his left. I reached into the left pocket of my quarter zip. The Lance Corporal tensed. I brought out my leather wallet, flipped it open, and held it up over my head where Tate could see it. I had a very clear idea of what to do with my hands when someone told me again that I did not belong. Tate squinted. He stepped to the railing of the platform. He pointed the scanner down at the ID in my hand. The little device beeped. Tate looked at the screen. The color went out of his face in a way I had only ever seen on a young officer before. He looked at the screen again. Then he looked at me. He turned away from the railing and toward the boatswain's mate of the watch. A young petty officer second class who had been standing at the announcement station with his eyes on the back of Tate's head for the last 90 seconds, and Tate said, quietly, just loud enough to carry to the boatswain, "Pipe the Admiral aboard, now!" The boatswain's eyes went wide. He brought the silver call to his lips. I heard the indrawn breath. The pipe wailed, 3 high tones across the morning air. Then the announcement carried through the topside loudspeakers, out over the pier, out into the marina layer. Expeditionary Strike Group 3, arriving. Every sailor on the quarterdeck snapped to attention. Every Marine on the quarterdeck snapped to attention. The Lance Corporal at the top of the brow let his M4 hang on its sling. He came to attention against the railing. His face was white. His eyes were fixed somewhere above my head, the way a young Marine's eyes go when he has finally understood that he has done something he cannot fix. From the bridge wing high above the quarterdeck, a figure in service khakis broke into a run. He came down the ladders fast, hand over hand on the rails. Captain Wade Caulfield, 49 years old, commanding officer of USS Tripoli, 15-year veteran of surface combatants. He hit the weather deck at the top of the brow at a sprint. He stopped. He saw the spilled coffee on the pier. He saw me at the bottom of the brow with my elbow bleeding. He saw the Lance Corporal. He said, "Admiral McNeil, ma'am, I had no idea you were aboard," I said calmly from the pier. "Captain Caulfield, your sentry shoved me off the brow. I'd like to come aboard now." I started up the brow. I went up it slowly. My elbow was throbbing. My tailbone was throbbing. The Lance Corporal at the top of the brow came to a kind of attention against the railing that I have seen Marines come to exactly twice in my career, and both times the Marine had been about to be relieved on the spot. From the amidships passageway, at a run, came Captain Lucas Briggs of the Marine Detachment in camis, his cover under his arm. He stopped at the head of the quarterdeck. He took in the Lance Corporal. He took in the coffee. He took in me, walking up the brow, blood on my right elbow. He did not say a word. I reached the top of the brow. I returned Lieutenant Junior Grade Tate's salute. I walked past the Lance Corporal without looking at him. I crossed the quarterdeck. The crew that had been drawn up by the sound of the pipe stood at attention along the bulkheads. The whole ship had gone quiet. I left my ball cap on the pier. Somebody picked it up later. I did not go back for it. The wardroom was full when I walked in. Word travels through a Navy ship faster than the pipe does, and word had already traveled. The XO was in the door before I was. He saluted. The department heads stood. The ship's corpsman, a hospital corpsman, first class with a kind face, came in behind me with a small green case, and I let him sit me down at the head of the wardroom table and clean and dress the elbow with the door open. He apologized the whole time. He said, "Ma'am, I am so sorry, ma'am." I said, "Stop apologizing and do your job, Doc." He did. I asked Captain Caulfield in front of his XO and his department heads for the morning's readiness briefing. He looked at me. He looked at the corpsman who was finishing the bandage. He looked back at me. He said, "Yes, ma'am, right away." I conducted the readiness brief in my charcoal quarter zip with a clean white bandage on my right elbow and the printout of yesterday's casualty report in front of me on the wardroom table. The department heads briefed in turn. The chief engineer briefed the number 2 main engine fuel state casualty. He did not flinch. I asked him for the actual number, not the brief. He gave it to me. He had the answer ready. I made a small note in my notebook. I moved on. After the brief, I asked for a private word with Captain Caulfield. He took me up to his at-sea cabin and closed the door. It was just the two of us. I sat in the chair across from his small desk. He stood for a moment before he sat, and I let him stand. Then I told him to sit. "Wade," I said, "walk me through how a sentry on your ship shoves a woman off the brow without identifying her." He started to answer the way a Navy captain answers any question from a flag officer. He started with the standing orders, the force protection condition, the watch posture, the fact that the morning's watch bill had been signed by the Marine Detachment Commander and approved by his XO. He talked about the security cordon and the unannounced visitor protocol and the gate badge system and the requirement that visitors approach the brow under escort and the audit log and the visitor pass tracker and the standing instruction for civilian deliveries, and he kept going. I let him get to the end of it. He ran out of words on his own. He sat there for a moment looking at his folded hands on the desk. I said, "Wade, does any part of what you just told me permit a Marine to put his hands on a woman in jeans?" He said quietly, "No, ma'am." I said, "What are you going to do about it?" He said, "Ma'am, I am going to start with myself. And I am going to start with my Marine Detachment Commander. And I am going to start with my officer of the deck, who I am going to congratulate later today for being the only person on the quarterdeck this morning who did his job correctly." I let that sit. He had not led with that piece. He had walked himself to it. That mattered to me. I said, "Wade, you are a good captain. Your sentry shoved a 46-year-old woman in civilian clothes off a brow because he did not recognize her. What does that tell you?" He said, "He has been on duty too long. We have been running short. I am going to fix the watch bill, ma'am, and I am going to fix the standards." I said, "I am not interested in why. I am interested in what we do now." I told him what I wanted: an investigation into Pike, an investigation into the watch standards on his ship, an investigation into the Marine Detachment's gangway training. The staff judge advocate would be on his ship by the close of business tomorrow. I wanted Captain Briggs in every gangway briefing for the next 2 weeks. I wanted his officer of the deck training program rewritten. I wanted him personally to spend 1 hour of every working day for the next month standing somewhere on his own quarterdeck, observing his own watches. I wanted, finally, the fuel state casualty fixed before the deployment in June. I told him I would be back the day after tomorrow. I drove home that evening on the 5, and I called my mother from the car. She picked up on the second ring. I told her, without drama, that a Marine had shoved me off my own gangway that morning. She was quiet for a long beat. Then she said, "Oh, sweetheart." I told her I was fine. She asked if I was going to tell my father. I said, "No." She was quiet for another long beat. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Nikki. I should have said something a long time ago." I did not answer. I was driving. The Marine layer was rolling in over the Coronado Bridge. I could see the lights of my own city across the bay. I let the silence run. Eventually I said, "Mom, I love you. I am fine. I will call you tomorrow." And I hung up. I got home at 6. I did not turn on the lights. I stood at the kitchen counter and drank a glass of water and looked at the bruise spreading across my elbow under the fresh bandage, and I thought, for the first time in 20 years, about my father's voice on the Oceanside Pier when I was 7, saying, "Floating hotel." And I understood in that moment that the shove had not been about a young Lance Corporal having a bad morning. There's a particular kind of bruise that is not on your arm. It is on the part of you that has been making excuses for the people who should have been making excuses for you. I had carried that bruise since I was 7. I had walked it through 24 years of uniform. I had walked it up the brow of my own flagship that morning. And a young Marine who did not know my face and did not look at my eyes had simply pressed on it. By 0600 the next morning, I was on the phone with my Chief of Staff. By 8, I had the Article 15 paperwork in motion against Lance Corporal Pike. By 10, I had ordered the top-to-bottom review of Gangway watchstanding aboard USS Tripoli. By noon, after a long conversation in the strike group legal office with my staff judge advocate, I had decided not to pursue a court-martial. The decision not to court-martial was harder than the decision to do anything else. The Lance Corporal had assaulted a flag officer in the performance of her duties. He had assaulted a civilian if you wanted to read the case that way, too. There was a fact pattern that, if I had handed it to any other strike group commander in the Navy, would have ended that young Marine's career and put him in the brig for 6 months. I had the authority as his convening authority. I could have signed the paperwork before lunch. I sat with the staff judge advocate, a lieutenant commander who had served as a Marine sergeant before law school. And we went through the options. She walked me through the timeline of a court-martial. She walked me through the consequences for Pike if convicted. Brig time, dishonorable discharge, loss of all benefits. Loss of the kind of life he had thought he was building when he raised his right hand at the recruiter's office at 18. She did not push me one way or the other. She gave me the law and the consequences, and she let me think. I asked her what an Article 15 plus mandatory remediation looked like. She walked me through it. Reduction in grade, forfeiture, restriction to the ship, remedial training, a letter in his service record that would follow him for the rest of his career and would, in all likelihood, cap him out at sergeant before he separated. I asked her, what does a Marine Master Sergeant tell his Lance Corporal to take? She smiled for the first time. She said, he tells him to take the Article 15 and shut up and read about himself for a year. I said, then we are taking the Article 15. 2 days later, I went to see Pike. I went to the Marine detachment spaces on the hangar deck of USS Tripoli. I did not bring my aide. I did not bring my Chief of Staff. I walked across the quarterdeck in service khakis with 2 stars on my collars, and I returned Lieutenant Junior Grade Tate's salute. And I went down the ladder and across the hangar bay and through the door into the small berthing and office area the Marine detachment used as its home aboard the ship. Captain Briggs called the detachment to attention. I told him to put them at ease. They went to a parade rest along the bulkheads, 18 of them. The gunnery sergeant was at the back of the room. Lance Corporal Pike was in the center of the deck. I asked Briggs for permission to address Pike. He nodded. I asked Pike to come forward. He took 3 careful steps and stopped at attention 3 feet from me. I told him to sit. He hesitated, looked at his gunny, then looked at me. I gestured at the bench along the bulkhead. He sat. I sat next to him. I said, Lance Corporal, look at me. He did. The whites of his eyes were a little too bright in the fluorescent light of the Marine berthing. I could see the angle of his jaw working. He was 21 years old. He was scared. He was also, I noticed, holding his composure. That was, in fact, what a Marine was supposed to do. I said, I want you to know who I am and what I do, because in the last 2 days you have been taught to be afraid of me, and that is not the lesson I want you to take from this. He nodded once. I told him I commanded the strike group his ship belonged to. I told him I had spent 24 years building the career that put me on his brow on Tuesday morning. I told him the shove was unacceptable. I told him the shove was also not going to define him if he did not let it. Then I told him about my father. I said, Lance Corporal, I was raised by a Marine Master Sergeant. My father has said the same things about the Navy that your posture said when I walked up the brow on Tuesday. You do not get to make the same assumption he made and call it duty. You are better than that. Your corps is better than that. He looked at me. He did not look away. I said, the Article 15 stands. You are losing your rank and your pay. You are restricted to the ship for 30 days. You are going to spend the next 6 weeks under your captain's direct mentorship, and you are going to read every book Captain Briggs hands you, and you are going to write him a 1-page paper on each one. And he is going to send those papers to me. Do you understand? He said, Yes, ma'am. I said, Lance Corporal. The reason I am not court-martialing you is not because what you did is small. It is because what you did is, in fact, the same dismissal I have heard for 24 years, and I am not interested in being the woman who breaks a kid for it. I am interested in being the admiral who teaches that kid what he could be instead. Do you understand? He said, Yes, ma'am. I stood. I returned Captain Briggs's nod. I walked out of the Marine berthing. The Marine detachment was on its feet, at attention, along the port and starboard bulkheads as I walked back through the hangar bay. Captain Briggs was at the head of his formation. He saluted me at the door. I returned it. I walked back across the quarterdeck. Lieutenant Junior Grade Tate, now in service khakis with a new ball cap of his own, was at the platform with the relief watch turned over. He saluted me. I returned it. I walked down the brow. At the bottom of the brow, somebody had put my ball cap on a small rack the boatswain had rigged. I do not know who. I picked it up. I held it for a moment. Then I walked across the pier to my SUV. 3 weeks passed. The Article 15 proceeded. Pike lost his Lance Corporal chevron and went down to private first class. He lost a month's pay. He went under his captain's mentorship. He wrote papers. Captain Briggs forwarded the papers to my flag aide. I read them in the evenings in my study. They were not great papers. They were honest papers. The third one, on a piece of the Marine Corps history I had not known myself, was actually good. The Marine detachment ran the Gangway remediation. The story stayed inside the lifelines. The Navy and the Marine Corps closed around the incident the way they close around any small wound that has been properly cleaned. There was no press call. There was no Slack screenshot. There was, I noticed slowly, an attitude shift on the quarterdeck of USS Tripoli that I had not seen on her quarterdeck before. I sailed on the Tripoli for a 4-day exercise off Southern California in the first week of April. The crew was different, the ship was different, the watch was different. The officer of the deck, every time I walked up the brow, called the bridge before I had taken my third step. The Marine sentry, every time I walked up the brow, came to attention and rendered the proper salute. The captain met me at the head of the brow exactly once, on the first day, and after that he let his XO meet me, which was correct. Caulfield was working. He had not been working before. He had been performing. He was working now. In a passageway on the hangar deck level, on a Wednesday afternoon, I passed Pike. He was in camis. He had the single chevron of a private first class on his collar. He came to attention against the bulkhead and said, "Ma'am." I stopped. I looked at him for a beat. I said, "Carry on, Marine." He said, "Aye, ma'am." I walked on. That night, in my flag cabin, I sat at the small desk and I thought about something I had not let myself think about in 20 years. I had spent 24 years braced. I had not put down the brace, not for a watch, not for a deployment, not for a promotion ceremony, not for a meal, not for a long weekend in Coronado with the windows open and a glass of wine on the patio. I had carried the brace the way you carry an old injury. I had not noticed I was carrying it until the morning a young Marine had put his hands on my chest, and I had stood up from the pier, and I had walked back up the brow, and I had heard the boatswain's pipe wail for me, and I had reached the top of the brow and felt, just for a moment, the brace come off. It came off. It did not come back on. I wrote one line in my notebook before I turned off the lamp. 24 years. I have not put down the brace for 24 years. 2 Saturdays later, my mother called me. She asked me to come up for lunch. She told me my father was going to be at the VFW for the afternoon. She used the words, "I want to talk to you," in a way that meant she had been working on the sentence for a week. I drove up the 5 with the windows down. The hills above Camp Pendleton were greening up from the winter rain. The pickup trucks on the freeway had Marine Corps stickers and Navy stickers and Air Force stickers, and I noticed them the way I had been noticing them since I was 12, with the small ache that comes from looking for your father's sticker on every truck on the freeway and never finding it. My mother had set the kitchen table the way she set it for guests. There was a plate of sandwiches and a bowl of fruit and a pitcher of iced tea with mint in it from the garden. We sat down across from each other at the same table where I had told my parents about my scholarship 29 years before. She did not lead up to it. She said, "Nicole, I should have said this when you were 18. I have been wanting to say it since then." I said, "Mom." She said, "I have always been proud of you. I never said it. I stayed quiet because I was afraid of your father. I'm not afraid of him anymore. I am 67 years old. I have been afraid of him for 45 of those years. I am done with that." I did not say anything for a while. I drank some of the iced tea. I looked at the small painting my mother had hung on the wall behind the table 30 years before, a watercolor of a fishing boat in Carlsbad that her mother had painted. I said, "I would have liked to hear that a long time ago, Mom." She said, "I know, Nikki, I know." We sat for a long time at the table. She told me she had been to a few of the readings I had given at women veterans events in San Diego over the years. She had never come up to me afterwards. She had not wanted me to know. She had wanted to see me work. She told me she had a small folder in the drawer of her bureau where she kept the news clippings from my command tour, the squadron change of command, the strike group change of command. She told me she had kept the photograph from the local paper that ran when I made lieutenant commander. I did not cry. I did say, "Mom, you could have come up to me after the readings." She said, "I know. I was building up the nerve. The truth is, the morning you called me from the car on Tuesday and told me a Marine had shoved you off the brow, I decided I was not going to wait any longer." We finished the sandwiches. We did the dishes together. I drove back down to Coronado with the windows open and the mountains on my left and the ocean on my right, and my mother's voice in my head saying, "I have been wanting to say it since then." And for the first time in my life, I let myself want a phone call from my father in the same way I had been wanting one when I was 18. The phone call came 2 weeks later. It was my mother. My father had had a small stroke. He was home. He was stable. The speech was mostly back. He wanted to see me. I drove up the 5 again. I did not bring my uniform. I did not bring anything. I walked into the living room, and there he was, in pajamas and a robe in his recliner, smaller than I had ever seen him. The right side of his face was a little slack. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw, in his eyes, that he had stopped being able to outlast me. I sat on the ottoman across from him. He started to say something halting that sounded like the beginning of an apology. I stopped him. I said, "Dad, I do not need an apology. I need you to listen." He looked at me. He nodded. I told him the story of the morning on the brow, every detail, the civilian clothes, the Lance Corporal, the shove, the fall, the walk back, the ID, the pipe, the whole ship coming to attention, the Article 15, the conversation with Pike, the reason I had not court-martialed him. I said, "I had a Marine Master Sergeant for a father. That is the reason I did not court-martial that Lance Corporal. I have been on the receiving end of that same dismissal my whole life. I did not want to break a kid for it." He sat with that for a long time. I let him sit. Then he said, quietly, "I never knew you'd be that woman." I said, "You never asked." He said, "Your mother said the same thing." There was a long silence. He said, "Tell me about the ships." So I told him. I told him about my flagship. I told him about her air wing detachment. I told him about the well deck and how a Marine Air Ground Task Force projects power off a big deck amphibious ship. I told him about the strike group's pre-deployment certification schedule and what a fuel state casualty rate looks like on a number 2 main engine. I told him how a strike group commander allocates her ammunition between 3 big deck amphibs. He asked me a question about it that was, in fact, a good question. I answered it. He listened. We sat that way for about an hour. My mother brought a cup of tea in and put it on the side table next to him and went back to the kitchen. When the hour was nearly up, he opened the drawer of the side table next to his recliner. He moved carefully because of the stroke. He took out a small, soft, dark object, the cover from his first Marine tour, the one he had given me in 1993 in the garage, the one I had handed back to him after a Christmas argument in 2001 I no longer wanted to remember. He held it out to me with his good hand. He said, "Your mother said you sent this back when you were 20. I have been thinking about it lately. I'd like you to take it back." I took it. I held it on my lap. I did not put it on. I did not need to. The point was not the cover. The point was that he had been carrying it in the drawer of his side table for 25 years and had decided, finally, to give it back. I said, "Thanks, Dad." I drove home that night, and I pulled over at the Oceanside Pier. I walked halfway out. A destroyer was outbound from San Diego, her lights moving south down the coast the way the one had moved when I was 7. I stood at the railing with the cover folded in my left hand. I watched her until she was past the point. The next 3 weeks were the last weeks of the workup. The strike group ran its final pre-deployment certification at sea off Southern California. The Tripoli was the flagship. I spent most of 3 weeks aboard. Sometime in the middle of those weeks, Captain Briggs came to my flag cabin and asked me, with the carefulness of a Marine officer requesting something of a Navy admiral he did not entirely know how to read, whether I would be willing to say a few words to the Marine detachment. He did not tell me why. I told him I would. I went down to the Marine berthing on the hangar deck level. Briggs called the detachment to attention. There were 18 of them. Pike was in the front row. I said, "Be seated." They sat on the benches and on the deck. The fluorescent lights were the same fluorescent lights they had been the day I had walked in to see Pike. The smell of polish and old coffee was the same. I stood at the front of the room with my hands behind my back. I spoke for less than 5 minutes. I told them about my father. I told them what it took for me to put on my uniform every morning for 24 years. I told them what I expected of a Marine. I told them what I expected of myself. I told them near the end, I am not the admiral who shoved my way onto this ship. I am the admiral who let your Lance Corporal shove me off it and walked back up the brow. That is the difference. I did not look at Pike. I did not need to. I thanked them. I left. In the passageway on the way back to my flag cabin, I ran into Caulfield. He had been waiting for me, I think. He said, "Ma'am, I do not think I ever properly apologized." I said, "Wade, you did, by how you have run this ship since." He said, "Permission to ask a question." I said, "Granted." He said, "When you walked back up the brow that morning, ma'am, did you ever think about not coming back up?" I thought about it for a long beat. He waited. I said, "No, Wade, I thought about how I was going to do it. I was always going to come back up." He nodded once. He did not say anything else. He walked back forward. On the last evening of the certification, I stood at the rail of the flag bridge as Tripoli came in past Point Loma. The lights of San Diego were coming up on the eastern horizon. The deck was humming under my feet. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, for the first time in 24 years, unbraced. I wrote one line in my notebook that night. He never came around. I came around without him. That counts. 2 weekends before deployment, my mother called and asked me up for Sunday lunch. She said my father was out of the recliner and slow, but moving. She said he wanted me to come. I drove up on a Sunday in late May. The hills were brown from the dry spring. The sycamores at the freeway exits were leafing out. I pulled into the driveway of the house where I had grown up at 12:15, and the front door opened before I was out of the car. My father was on the porch. He was wearing a navy ball cap. It was a plain navy ball cap, dark blue, embroidered with a small gold anchor and the words, United States Navy, on the front. My mother had clearly bought it for him at the base exchange. He was wearing it the way a man wears a hat he has owned his whole life and never thought about, which is to say, he was wearing it like it was a hat. He did not draw attention to it. He nodded at me from the porch. He said, "Hey, Nikki." I said, "Hey, Dad." I did not mention the hat. I never mentioned the hat. He wore it for the rest of his life. And I never mentioned it. My mother and I lied about it together for the rest of his life. We told each other, with our eyes in the kitchen, that the hat had always been there. It had not. It was new the day I drove up that Sunday. It is, I think, the single most affectionate object my father ever bought himself, and he never said one word about it. We ate lunch on the patio. The food was plain and good. My father asked me halfway through about the wardroom mess at Say. He wanted to know what we ate. He wanted to know how a chief cook plans a 6-month deployment menu. He wanted to know whether we really did Steel Beach picnics on the flight deck on Sundays. I told him about the Steel Beach. He listened the way I had wanted him to listen since I was 9 years old. He laughed once at the line about the hot dog grill on the elevator. He laughed for real. My mother watched him laugh. After lunch, he asked me to walk with him to the front of the house. We walked slowly, his good arm in mine. We stopped behind his pickup. The Marine Corps sticker was still there. It had been on the back window of that pickup since 1986. It was sun-faded now. Next to it, fresh, was a small Expeditionary Strike Group 3 sticker. The kind a chief at the base exchange sells you for $3 and a smile. He said, "Your mother found it for me." I looked at it for a long time. I could feel my mother in the kitchen window watching us. I said, "It looks good there, Dad." He stood next to me with his hands in his pockets, and we looked at the back of the pickup the way fathers and daughters look at things in driveways. He did not say anything else. He did not have to. We walked back to the front porch. I hugged my mother. I hugged my father, who hugged me back with one good arm, and I felt his good hand briefly on the back of my neck the way I remembered him doing it when I was 8 years old in a parking lot at Camp Pendleton. And he said, slow but clear, "Sweetheart, you sail safe." I said, "I will." I drove back to the base that afternoon with the windows down. The Pacific was on my right. The strike group was on my mind. The cover from my father's first Marine tour was folded in the breast pocket of my cardigan. The ESG-3 sticker was on the back of his pickup behind me. My mother's voice was still in my head. So was my father's, this time saying something kind. If you have ever been shoved off the brow of your own life by somebody who did not bother to read who you were, walk back up. Quietly, in whatever clothes you have on. Do not raise your voice. The pipe will wail for you. The ship will come to attention. And the people who refused to see you for 46 years will be standing there when you reach the top. And they will know, finally, who you have been the whole time. If you stayed with me to the end of that morning, thank you. Walking back up that brow took 24 years of work before I could do it the way I did. The pipe wailed for me because the work was real. The whole ship came to attention because the work was real. The Expeditionary Strike Group 3 sticker my mother bought for my father's pickup, fading next to his Marine Corps one in his driveway, came because the work was real. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk back up the brow of your own life after somebody shoved you off it? Would you have court-martialed Lance Corporal Pike, or would you have made the call I did? And for the daughters and sons of fathers who never came around the way you needed them to, what does coming around look like in your house? If this story landed for you, hit subscribe and tell me your story in the comments. I read them.